Trapped in a bunker while the Mafia burns her boss, Manchison, to the ground, she grabs her gun. Emma isn't meant to be in this war. She's just a cleaner. But as she watches Lucian fighting a losing battle against 20 armed men on the security cameras, she absolutely snaps. Smashing open the weapons cabinet, she and her wheelchair-bound brother march straight into the crossfire to save the crime lord who saved them. For 14 months, our subject, Emma, exhibited classic avoidance behavior, attempting to erase herself within the periphery of a brutal syndicate. She thought anonymity meant safety, but in a dark alley, 3 Iliasklin cornered her. They did not want her to use her severe physical trauma as a bloody transmission. As the blunt force fractured her jaw, her final cognitive anchor was her brother, Caleb. Yet, instead of expiring in the gutter, she regains consciousness beneath the glaring crystal of a ruthless kingpin's estate. You and I are going to unpack this case file together because it exposes a chilling behavioral truth. We assume keeping our heads down protects us, but making yourself small only turns you into the perfect victim for monsters to exploit. We must rewind the timeline to observe her baseline state. A clock tolls 11 times through the sterile corridors. Emma leans on an industrial mop, her central nervous system flooded with chronic exhaustion. Her hands are chemically burned 6 hours into a grueling shift. Within this house of sociopathic violence, her primary defense mechanism is total psychological erasure. She scrubs biological evidence from the floorboards, instinctively avoiding the gaze of the architect of this terror, Lucien Varley. To speak his name is to trigger an immediate fear response. Her pathology teaches us a grim lesson about human survival. Passivity feels like a shield in the moment, but silencing your own voice guarantees that an apex predator will eventually dictate your reality. Before tonight, her visual exposure to Lucien was limited to exactly 11 encounters. She observed his tailored silhouette slicing through the room, projecting an aura of dominance that suppresses the respiratory rates of hardened killers. This is a textbook display of predatory intimidation. The head housekeeper, Clara, interrupts her routine. Clara is the singular positive stimulus in this cold void, the only staff member who acknowledges Emma by name. She advises the girl to cease working, but Emma fixates on a fresh bloodstain. The extra wages fund physical rehabilitation for her paralyzed brother. We see here the agonizing clinical reality of extreme devotion. True sacrifice does not require an audience. It silently absorbs the suffering to protect its deepest attachments. Clara drops her professional affect, her eyes heavy with genuine concern regarding the imminent storm. We track Emma as she secures her supplies, elevating her coat collar before exiting into the freezing October climate. The wind is aggressive, carrying the atmospheric shift of impending violence. Her transit route spans a mere 4 blocks. Because this grid is monitored by Varley enforcers, it boasts a statistically low mortality rate. She has executed this behavioral loop hundreds of times. But tonight, her amygdala fires a sudden warning. The flickering lamps distort the shadows, triggering a primal neurological alarm at the base of her skull. It is a critical biological imperative. When your internal threat detection system screams that the darkness is alive, you must run. She accelerates her motor functions as rain assaults the pavement. The auditory input narrows to a singular, terrifying stimulus. Deliberate footfalls pacing her exactly. Her respiratory rate spikes into panic. She executes a sharp left into an alley, attempting to break the pursuit, but the footsteps mirror her trajectory. Suddenly, a massive figure detaches from a blind spot, terminating her escape route. His posture is relaxed, indicative of a predator cornering prey. He coldly inquires if she is affiliated with the Vali organization. Notice her physiological reaction. Instead of the flight response, she experiences catastrophic tonic immobility. True fear is a paralyzing neurotoxin. It proves that all human logic evaporates the second profound terror steps into your reality. Let us examine this interaction closely. She attempts to project emotional regulation, denying any syndicate affiliation. That fragile shield shatters when a derisive laugh echoes behind her. Emma pivots to see two additional subjects emerge from the downpour. She vocalizes desperate submission, identifying herself as a mere cleaner. The primary aggressor steps forward, exposing a jagged facial laceration. He smiles with chilling psychopathy, stating that her absolute innocence makes her the optimal canvas for their violent message. This is a brutal constant in criminal pathology. Innocence never acts as a shield against a sociopath. It acts as a magnet. She attempts a desperate evasion, but a dominant hand violently throws her into the concrete abyss. The assault is a clinical study in severe blunt force trauma. A kinetic strike fractures her mandible before her vocal cords can even engage. Her neurological pain receptors overload. The dominant subject mutters a sociopathic rationalization as a secondary strike shatters her ribs. She assumes the fetal position, but heavy boots impact her spine. Her respiration turns to liquid fire. Yet, within this distress, we observe a powerful psychological tether, her brother, Caleb. If her biological functions cease, his survival probability drops to zero. This demonstrates the profound resilience of the human psyche. A deep emotional anchor generates the impossible leverage to push upward, even as the skeleton fails. Tragically, a final blow terminates her resistance. The violence abruptly terminates on a verbal command. Their sadistic objective requires her cardiovascular system to remain active. A deceased proxy cannot transmit trauma to a kingpin. The assailants evaporate. Emma is left hemorrhaging on the asphalt, her visual cortex shutting down. We observe a temporal skip. A piercing luminance forces her pupils to contract. Her nervous system registers catastrophic damage. A clinical voice instructs her to minimize movement, diagnosing multiple fractures. She forces her eyes to focus. The alley has been replaced by opulent crystal chandeliers. The psychological lesson is chilling. Surviving a brutal, chaotic storm often merely deposits the victim directly into the terrifying epicenter of a meticulously controlled, much deadlier hurricane. Through her concussion fog, she registers a physician bound to syndicate trauma care. He clinically deconstructs her reality. She is secured inside the fortified compound of Lucien Valley. Stick with me here, because this is the exact moment the pathological power dynamics shift. Ignoring the acute pain from her fractures, Emma attempts to breach containment, driven by her fixation on Caleb. Before the physician can initiate restraints, a massive silhouette eclipses the threshold. An unyielding voice dominates the room, confirming her brother has already been relocated to the estate. The megalomaniacal narcissist does not merely lock you inside a cage. He effortlessly transports everything you love into the cell right alongside you, guaranteeing your absolute psychological compliance. Lucien Valley commands the perimeter, projecting the terrifying sovereignty of an apex predator. As their visual contact solidifies, paralyzing dread suppresses her respiratory function. In a completely flat tone, he recites the private data points of her existence, deliberately leveraging Caleb's paralysis as a psychological weapon. This catastrophic breach of privacy deeply destabilizes her. She breathlessly questions his intelligence gathering. He advances, asserting absolute omnipotence over his territory. He clinically admits he utilized her labor for a year without ever learning her name. This exposes the core pathology of the elite criminal mind. Human beings are utterly invisible mechanisms until the exact second they mutate into liabilities. Gathering her residual courage, she finally asserts her identity. Emma Vale. The lens captures his micro-expressions as he vocalizes her name. He systematically dismantles her defenses, reciting her exact financial deficit of $118,000. Each metric is deployed as a calculated strike. When she attempts visual evasion, his dominant gaze forces compliance. Lucien clinically discloses that Caleb is secured under specialized medical surveillance. Emma experiences acute cognitive dissonance, demanding his true motive. His facial muscles lock. He dictates that absorbing violence within his geographical boundaries permanently converts her into his exclusive property. He processes her severe trauma not as a human tragedy, but as a direct narcissistic injury to his own reputation. Observe the mechanics of extreme manipulation. The sociopath never issues genuine remorse. They simply overwrite your objective reality to insulate their ego. The focus tightens on Lucien's unblinking state. In a tone devoid of empathy, he identifies the aggressors as assets of a hostile syndicate, initiating territorial conflict. They utilized her fractured skeleton as a primitive communication device. Emma exhibits severe panic, desperately pleading to be excised from this sociopathic warfare. To a megalomaniac narcissist, a subject's innocence is an irrelevant data point. He unilaterally decrees her existence, is now subsumed under his absolute jurisdiction. The rival assets are scheduled for extreme termination, and you and I know exactly what kind of brutal theater that entails. Lucien severs her pleas with glacial finality. Her personal agency is permanently deleted. This is the haunting prognosis. Once a pathological system envelops you, the illusion of free will is entirely eradicated. She is now a captive pawn on his psychological chessboard. You and I must recognize the exact moment a megalomaniac narcissist springs his trap. Lucien stands in the cold light, a predator perfectly comfortable in the shadows. He calmly lists his manipulations. He paid her rent, covered the medical bills, secured her brother. Emma sits trembling, her nervous system in pure fight or flight, as she rejects his financial control. But the deal is done. He frames this as protection, neatly isolating his victim. She accurately identifies this as captivity, her eyes welling with the exhaustion of the hunted. But consider this simple life lesson. Sometimes the person pulling you from a blazing fire is just moving you into a fireproof cage. He requires her absolute dependence, and her compliance is all that matters. The room turns hostile as Lucien drops his voice to a lethal register. Emma breathes through the sharp agony of fractured ribs, desperately asserting her autonomy. She yells that he does not own her, exhibiting a textbook defense mechanism. A flash of grandiosity crosses his eyes. He steps into her space, claiming he does not own her, but asserting total responsibility for her existence. The heavy door shuts like a maximum security vault. Emma collapses inward, the psychological weight of her new reality crushing her. The life lesson here is harsh but unavoidable. Fighting a rip current only guarantees you drown much faster. Hours later, her trauma manifests physically. She jolts awake in pitch blackness, terrified by the raw, guttural sound of someone screaming in the dark. It takes 3 agonizing seconds for her brain to process that the screaming is tearing from her own throat. a classic dissociative panic response. She jolts upright, but heavy hands pin her trembling shoulders to the mattress. A shadowed nurse forces her to regulate her breathing, stopping her from ripping out the medical lines. Emma hyperventilates, desperately demanding to know where Caleb is. The nurse states the boy is asleep, safely contained by the boss's design. Emma forces the nurse to put her battered body into a wheelchair, needing to verify his safety. It is a clinical picture of sheer helplessness. Yet life teaches us a vital lesson. Sometimes knowing when to let someone else push the wheels is the only way you survive. They slowly roll down a silent, freezing corridor. Let us unpack this behavioral anchor together. Caleb rests in a clinical bed, lit by the cold pulse of medical monitors. He is the sole variable keeping Emma tethered to reality. She rolls forward, gripping his hand like a lifeline over a psychological abyss. Caleb blinks awake, analyzes her bruised face, and bluntly notes how terrible she looks. She manages a fractured smile, assessing him for trauma. He explains 2 suited men simply took him. His emotional wall crumbles as he confesses he believed she was dead. Emma smooths his hair, shaking with residual adrenaline, confirming they survived. Life dictates that the most resilient human bonds are forged in the most brutal conditions. Caleb then innocently marvels at the absolute luxury of his new captivity. Caleb shifts against the pillows, questioning their captor's identity. Emma avoids eye contact, showing deep anxiety as she labels the man as highly dangerous. Caleb cannot rationalize why a sociopathic boss would intervene. Then the boy delivers a psychological shockwave. Lucian has eliminated her entire financial debt. Emma freezes as a massive stressor is violently erased. Her immediate response is pure outrage, swearing they will never accept laundered charity. Caleb snaps back, his young brain conditioned by street survival. The child makes a brilliant point. The core life lesson here is that foolish pride has never kept oxygen flowing into your lungs. Emma understands the clinical reality. Every gift from a narcissist is a loaded weapon. They just do not know the price yet. Caleb begs her to compartmentalize the inevitable fallout. Right now, his basic needs are met, and she is not bleeding out in an alley. Emma desperately wants to verbalize the catastrophic consequences of this dynamic, but profound exhaustion overrides her panic. Over the next 3 days, her cognition blurs beneath heavy sedatives. Her fractured ribs feel like grinding glass. Yet consider this critical life lesson hidden inside trauma. Sometimes you must willingly endure a punishing storm just so the people you love can stay dry. Caleb is finally consuming warm meals, his rare laughter echoing through the halls. Watching her brother's nervous system finally regulate makes this bargain with a sociopath feel entirely rational. She would gladly sign the contract in her own blood. You and I will look at this isolation phase together. Sensory deprivations inside a sprawling mansion often breaks a subject faster than street violence. Emma does not encounter the narcissistic architect of her confinement for days. Lucian strategically remains a phantom, increasing her psychological tension. On the 4th day, the baseline shifts. Clara declares Mr. Vari demands her presence. It is an absolute directive. Dressing herself feels like the dissociated march of a condemned prisoner. Emma crosses the floors she once scrubbed on her knees. Life demonstrates that our greatest elevations come wrapped in our deepest terrors. They pause at a heavy wooden door. A single knock. Lucian's dark voice bleeds through the solid oak, commanding his subject to enter. We observe a study dripping with intimidating wealth, pure environmental dominance. Lucian stands by the window, withholding eye contact as he commands her to sit. Her traumatized ribs flare with pain as she sinks into the dark leather. He clinically notes her healing and Caleb's stabilization. Emma forces out a token of gratitude, but the submission is sickening. Lucian instantly pivots. His facial affect is flat, yet his eyes betray a manic intensity. He strictly conditions her never to thank him again. He leans over his desk, the apex predator breaking through his civilized exterior. A harsh life lesson dictates that pathological favors are never fully wiped clean. He coldly reveals he found the 3 men who assaulted her, noting their violent interrogation was highly productive. Emma demands to know the exact nature of his retaliation. Lucian maintains a hollow stare, stating he executed the necessary protocols. He clinically details how a rival named Krovic used those assailants to probe his dominance. Emma's anger spikes, accusing this narcissist of using her trauma to reinforce his image. Lucian explains that displaying vulnerability would dismantle his entire empire. Emma stubbornly denies her integration into his cartel. Lucian immediately crushes this cognitive dissonance. The ultimate life lesson is that begging a monster for safety only ensures your placement in a more secure cage. Krovic has identified her and the boy, leaving guarantees her termination. In his fractured psychology, absolute protection and total possession are the exact same concept. Stick with me here. We are observing a profound psychological standoff. Emma glares at this megalomaniac, white-knuckling the remains of her autonomy. He reinforces her rage, noting that aggression ensures survival. Beneath the anger, her limbic system is flooded with terror. She details years spent building her independence. Furious, he erased her identity in 4 days. Lucian exhibits zero remorse, framing his actions as vital security. Emma correctly calls it a prison. Lucian coldly notes this specific prison maintains her vital signs. Stockholm Syndrome takes root as she rationalizes staying for Caleb's security. It is a harsh truth, but sometimes the trauma bonds that trap us are exactly what keep us breathing. Love is the ultimate psychological cage. And just like that, the psychological conditioning locks into place. She asks the duration of her confinement, and the room drops into clinical silence. Lucian admits her release requires the total destruction of Krovic. Emma's emotional dam breaks as she declares her absolute hatred for him. Consider this diagnostic lesson. Sometimes pure hatred is the only functional bridge connecting 2 severely damaged minds. Lucian casually accepts her hostility, noting she will at least be alive to despise him. Suddenly, an enforcer violently breaches the room. A massive external stressor has occurred. Krovic hijacked a shipment and eliminated 6 operatives. The baseline tension instantly spikes. The brutal attack happened merely 20 minutes ago, and the rival left a highly specific message. The enforcer is visibly terrified to speak. Lucian clenches his fists, demanding the message. The subordinate stammers that Krovic will use Emma as a pressure point. Lucian faces a psychological binary, chose his empire or his obsession. Emma sits paralyzed. For 3 seconds, Lucian stops breathing. You and I know a subject's pathology reveals itself under extreme duress. The narcissist fractures. He shatters a crystal object against the wall with the violent crack of a gunshot. He evicts the enforcer, completely abandoning his icy facade. Emma attempts a quiet retreat, but he barks her name. Schwalders vibrate with enraged fury as he diagnoses their grim reality. This nightmare only concludes with a fatality. Emma flees down the hall until her adrenal system completely crashes. We find the subject, Emma, physically collapsing, her bruised ribs a mere echo of acute psychological trauma. You and I have seen this in the wards, the crushing weight of misplaced guilt. 6 enforcers are dead, but her mind erroneously assumes the blame. In reality, the syndicate boss, Lucian, is displaying textbook megalomaniacal narcissism, orchestrating a bloodbath and using her as moral justification. When Marcus carries her catatonic frame to a bed, the night offers zero respite. She remains paralyzed by the clinical detachment in Lucian's eyes. While rival leaders drink to hollow victories, Lucian methodically readies his weaponry. Emma's 2-day isolation is a classic defense mechanism. Sometimes, completely retreating into a silent dark room is the only way a fractured psyche can brace for a violent storm. By the 3rd morning, the subject remains entirely dissociated, staring blankly at the skyline. Her brother Caleb enriches her decision, his harsh tone masking a deep fraternal terror. When he probes her mental state, Emma's psychological dam ruptures. She breaks down under the phantom weight of 6 casualties, exhibiting severe survivor's guilt. But Caleb physically anchors her, applying a crude but effective cognitive intervention. He forces her to recognize that those men were eradicated because they challenged an apex predator, not because of her. Let us take this clinical truth to heart. Surviving a traumatic event does not mean you orchestrated the violence. The healthiest mental adjustment we can make is to systematically release our guilt over uncontrollable variables, leaving the monsters to their own destruction. The subject is visibly drowning in an ocean of pathological guilt, relying on physical isolation as a coping mechanism. Caleb attempts to initiate the necessary stages of trauma recovery. Emma tries to accept his rationalization, yet her intrusive thoughts fixate on Lucian's promise of absolute violence. Driven by an acute flight response, she begs her brother to run. Caleb methodically deconstructs this irrational ideation. He reminds her of the grim realities. Fleeing means returning to a freezing apartment and untreated injuries. He forces her to examine the fatal nature of her pride. The behavioral lesson here is deeply counterintuitive. True psychological resilience is not always about standing unprotected in a hostile environment. Often, survival dictates allowing a far more dangerous predator to shield you from the flames. Emma paces, attempting to manually trigger the protective anger that previously shielded her from childhood trauma. But that emotional reservoir is depleted, leaving a dangerous, hollow affect. Desperate for kinetic stimulation to silence her hyperactive nervous systems, she wanders into the manor's subterranean levels. She stops at a basement door, her amygdala screaming at her to flee. Yet she remains paralyzed by morbid fascination. Inside, Lucian is systematically dismantling a training bag. His strikes are an exercise in mechanical, psychopathic violence, entirely devoid of normal emotional regulation. It is a fascinating reflection of human behavioral patterns. We often wander blindly through depressive episodes looking for our lost vitality, only to become hopeless, mesmerized by a destructive inferno that could easily consume us. The lighting exposes a ballistic scar on his shoulder, a physical ledger of a chronic, hyperviolent lifestyle. He moves with the fluid, predatory mechanics of a wolf. Without warning, the physical exertion ceases. His dark eyes lock onto the doorway, pinning his subject in the shadows. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifts instantly, suffocating in its intensity. He closes the distance with calculated steps, while Emma exhibits a classic freeze response. He halts mere inches away, the space radiating a toxic mixture of adrenaline and primal aggression. He issues a low, territorial warning. Consider the subconscious motivations at play here. We rarely act without a psychological driver. We instinctively navigate the darkness until we stand exactly where our most repressed, terrifying compulsions demand we be. Suppressing her physical pain, Emma clinically observes her own compulsive need to test boundaries in highly dangerous environments. A micro-expression of amusement briefly interrupts the killer's flat affect. Challenging a syndicate boss indicates a severe lack of self-preservation, yet defiance overrides her freeze response. She calmly updates him on her brother's condition, the unspoken trauma creating a palpable psychological pressure. She then breaks the silence, directly questioning the collateral damage being executed on her behalf. Instantly, Lucian's features calcify into an impenetrable, narcissistic mask, commanding her to ignore the reality. It requires extraordinary cognitive endurance to ask if you are the catalyst for mass casualties. The clinical takeaway is profound. It demands a highly evolved psyche to accept that horrifying data without flinching. As Lucian invades her personal space, his physical dominance triggers an immediate physiological response. He systematically devalues his rival, utilizing Emma's existence as psychological justification for his sociopathic violence. When she critiques his methodology, he erects a dissociative barrier, slipping into the cold persona of a kingpin to dismiss her. However, this aggressive rejection activates Emma's dormant fight response. She steps directly into his toxic orbit, refusing to ignore a war fueled by her survival. Lucian pivots, his lethality spiking, and questions if she genuinely wishes to observe the grotesque anatomy of his vengeance. Let us analyze this mechanism together. Clinging to deliberate ignorance offers a temporary cognitive sanctuary, but denying reality always inflicts a far more devastating psychological wound in the final analysis. The physical proximity is clinically fascinating. He eradicates the final boundary, forcing Emma into prolonged, stressful eye contact. He vehemently rejects her classification as a mere tactical pawn. Driven by desperation, she verbalizes an extraction plan, fleeing with her brother. Lucian's hands form rigid fists as he delivers a grim diagnostic truth. Geographic relocation will never sever her psychological tether to his identity. She attempts a counter-interrogation, asking if she is merely a narcissistic supply in a gilded cage. Instantly, his highly constructed sociopathic exterior fractures. He confesses that dominance is irrelevant to him. His singular, terrifying fixation is her biological continuity. The tragedy of the human condition is that we frequently misdiagnose captivity as safety, entirely unaware that the most inescapable prisons are built from pathological care. The environmental stress reaches a critical threshold. Emma demands to understand the etiology of this extreme attachment, why an apex criminal would symbiotically link himself to a civilian. The megalomaniac finally exhibits structural failure. He attempts to intellectualize his behavior as a security protocol, but her emotional dysregulation shatters his cognitive dissonance. His composure disintegrates until he is actively pleading for her to withdraw. Witnessing a predator exhibit such profound submissiveness is a catastrophic behavioral anomaly. She spends the nocturnal hours processing this trauma bond, fixated on his apocalyptic ideation. By dawn, shattered treaties confirm the onset of warfare. The clinical reality is uncompromising. When a highly destructive personality identifies you as their sole psychological vulnerability, the fatal conditioning is already irreversible. You and I are going to unpack the pathology of this incident. Emma experiences a paralytic episode outside the negotiation room, Within, a syndicate member proposes neutralizing the conflict by surrendering Emma. Lucian's response is a textbook exhibition of narcissistic rage, daring the subordinate to finish the vocalization. The negotiation terminates with the auditory feedback of massive, blunt force trauma. Lucian ejects the operatives, his voice strained with unregulated psychopathic fury. 3 conditioned enforcers retreat into the corridor, displaying acute physiological panic. Another violent impact reverberates from the sanctum. Survival instincts dictate rapid evacuation. Yet, the profound psychological lesson is this: the apex of human resilience is deciphering when to initiate a flight response and when to deliberately step directly into the epicenter of a violent rupture. Overriding her anxiety, Emma reasserts her autonomy and knocks on the damaged door. Lucian initially projects a high-decibel verbal assault, but his hostile effect dissolves upon visual confirmation of his primary attachment. The room is a study in unregulated, destructive outbursts. He stands rigid, displaying lacerations on his hands, displaying zero avoidance. She demands to know if she is merely a tradable asset. He exhibits classic pursuit behavior, vehemently denying commodifying her existence. Emma counters with a stabilizing cognitive boundary, explicitly stating she is not property. The sudden spike of primal panic in his eyes paralyzes him completely. This highlights a tragic cognitive distortion. We compulsively attempt to construct impenetrable cages around the individuals we fear losing, fundamentally failing to understand that a human consciousness violently resists complete ownership. The psychological undercurrents here are highly irregular. Lucian is acutely cognizant of her physical aversion, recognizing his classification as a wealthy incarcerator. Divested of his sociopathic defense mechanisms, he initiates a radical emotional disclosure. His vast criminal infrastructure holds zero value if it fails to act as her absolute barrier. When Emma argues they lack interpersonal history, he dismantles the logic. He has obsessively catalogued her behavioral resilience, noting how she breaks herself to maintain her sibling. His tremors expose an internalized guilt for dragging her into his lethal orbit. Questioned on his core motivation, his response is absolute. He would gladly orchestrate the thermal destruction of the city to guarantee her safety. It is a terrifying clinical paradox when an apex predator transforms into the solitary pillar, preventing your psyche from total fragmentation. Let us open this case file and examine the scene together. We are looking at a ruined study, the heavy with shadows and the copper scent of fresh blood. Every survival instinct should compel Emma to flee this underworld kingpin. Yet she plants her feet. Observe her trembling hands grasping the soaked wrist of a megalomaniac who commands absolute terror. She bypasses his dark bravado, her fragile voice demanding bandages, ordering the city's most lethal predator to sit. Fascinatingly, the Titan obeys. She presses burning alcohol to his torn flesh, and he takes the fire without a flinch. The clinical takeaway here is profound. In the darkest corners of a fractured life, true healing only begins when we offer fierce empathy to the very monster we were taught to fear. The atmosphere becomes suffocatingly intimate as Lucian sits in absolute silence. His predatory gaze tracks her movements, triggering a tremor in her hands. His voice reinforces the boundary that she remains his captive. But as she tightens the bandage, Emma shatters that delusion. She confesses he is not her captor, but the reason she is breathing. The heavy air freezes. A fracture of terrified hope cracks through the narcissist's marble expression. He whispers, asking if there is a difference anymore. She holds his torn hand, admitting she is still figuring that out. Slowly, his scarred fingers brush her jawline. It is a quiet tragedy how we construct towering walls to block out pain, entirely blind to the fact that we are starving the people, desperately trying to love us. His touch carries a heartbreaking gentleness, an anomaly for his violent pathology. He murmurs that she has every right to despise him. She admits she is trying to do exactly that, displaying the cognitive dissonance of Stockholm Syndrome. Neither pulls away. Then, the sound of heavy boots hammers against the floorboards, shattering the psychological spell. Emma jolts backward as the enforcer shoves the door open. Instantly, the vulnerable man vanishes, replaced by the freezing mask of the syndicate boss. The news is a waking nightmare. A rival family just slaughtered 8 soldiers and leveled a cat. This exposes the grim reality of their dark world. The innocent will forever pay the heaviest tax in blood whenever powerful. Prideful men decide to play their violent games of control. Lucian hardens his posture into absolute steel. When his voice slices through the tension, it rings with calculated destruction. He orders a midnight meeting, dismissing warnings of an ambush. The last trace of warmth bleeds from his eyes. Emma stands paralyzed, watching the wounded man morph back into a weapon. Gripped by panic, she asks what happens if he dies tonight. He does not flinch. His voice goes clinically dead as he lists the cash, the safe house, and the guards assigned to protect her and Caleb. She fires back that his bloody money means nothing, but his lifeless expression silences her. He commands her to lock the door. It is a profound tragedy when a broken man measures his entire human worth solely by the security he can purchase for the souls he quietly loves. You and I must examine the psychological horror of his parting words. Lucian invades her space, delivering instructions pulled from a trauma nightmare. He orders her to fight viciously if soldiers breach the estate. Stripping away his narcissistic pride, he begs her to do whatever is necessary to survive. The desperation in his eyes forces her to swallow her panic and whisper a shaking vow. The second the door clicks shut, her knees buckle against the floorboards. The following hours are sheer mental torture. She huddles in the dark with Caleb, forcing a brave smile while men barricade the mansion. We often assume the worst part of conflict is bloodshed. In truth, the deepest agony is the suffocating silence, sitting powerless in the shadows, waiting for violence to arrive. The fragile silence fractures past 6 in the evening. Caleb sits with his small shoulders trembling, absorbing the doom settling over the mansion. Even the hardened enforcers are dripping with sweat, a physiological omen of impending violence. When her brother asks where the boss went, Emma spins a fragile fabrication. She claims Lucian left to protect the neighborhood, burying the reality that he is marching into a trap to ensure she keeps breathing. Caleb asks if the dark man is ever coming back. Emma grips his hand until her knuckles turn white. She admits she does not know, swearing they will survive even as her stomach turns. True courage is rarely about possessing a fearless heart. Often, it is projecting a calm certainty to shield the innocent, while your own mind hangs by a thread. Notice the dysregulated energy as Emma paces her bedroom, flinching at every creak. She tries to rationalize that he is just a ruthless criminal, yet the heavy ache in her chest betrays that cognitive lie. Minutes before midnight, she drifts to the grand foyer, just as Lucian descends the staircase. He is draped in black, radiating the aura of an apex predator. His voice is ice as he orders her to remain hidden. Fighting her shaking breaths, she asks if he is taking his army. He shakes his head, just 4 soldiers. It is a quiet display of power, kept small to delay a massacre. He locks his dark eyes onto hers. The rational mind will invent 1,000 excuses to run from a burning building, but a trauma-bonded heart will always anchor your feet to the flames. Picture the contrast of this scene with me. The crime boss stands in the hallway, speaking with chilling calmness about sacrificing his life. Emma is drowning in panic, gripping his jacket and begging him to stop sounding like a man marching to his execution. Then the impossible happens. This merciless monster softens. His rough fingers rise to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. He murmurs she is infinitely more valuable than his empire. He demands she grab Caleb and run the second the perimeter falls. She digs her nails into his wrist, commanding him to survive. We both know the clinical truth here. Authentic love is never built on extravagant wealth. It is found in the terrifying promise a person makes right before they walk into an inferno just to spare you from the heat. Lucian leans down, resting his forehead against hers to deliver a farewell. But Emma violently refuses the ending he is writing. Her fingers twist into his shirt, swearing that if he dies tonight, she will hate him forever. A low laugh escapes his throat as he points out her hatred is hardly a threat. She fiercely replies, it is the only weapon she has left. Observe how a stubborn, defiant rage is often the most powerful psychological anchor we possess against total despair. Outside, an engine roars to life. He whispers his time is up, yet neither shifts an inch. Then, his hands frame her face, pulling her into a desperate kiss. There is no romance here, only a collision of raw panic and survival. He swears he will return, tearing himself away into the shadows. Listen as the tires fade into the night. The reality of the impending slaughter drops like a weight over the estate. Emma locks herself in the study, paralyzed by the torture of the unknown. The clock ticks mercilessly, stretching the agony into the freezing isolation of 2, then 3. This exposes a painful behavioral truth. We rarely recognize the depth of our attachment until we face the terror of losing someone forever. The mansion feels like a sealed tomb as she prays for the ruthless man who saved her. Then, just before dawn, the silence shatters. Heavy boots slam against the marble foyer. Ignoring the pain in her ribs, Emma bolts down the staircase, freezing in pure horror. 4 battered enforcers drag a motionless 5th man across the threshold. Witness the gravity of this tragic frame with me. The fallen figure is Lucian, his suit saturated in blood. Emma feels the foyer spin, eyes locked on the crimson trail staining the marble. Yet, in a stunning display of willpower, the fallen boss lifts his heavy head. He finds her through the haze, locking his failing eyes with hers, forcing a heartbreaking smile. He murmurs that he kept his promise. The next second, his body surrenders. Emma's scream tears through the hall as he crashes down. She drops to her knees, hands hovering over his chest. We learn a profound clinical lesson here. The purest form of human loyalty only reveals itself when chaos reigns, and we are stripped of all power. She begs him to stay awake, screaming for the medic. Looking at his pale face, she knows his time is spent. Let us open the file on this blood-soaked evening. Emma presses her bare hands against Lucian's catastrophic wounds, screaming at the surviving guards. A bleeding enforcer stammers that the parley was an orchestrated snare by Vittorio, a classic megalomaniac narcissist who thrives on theatrical slaughter. As panic fractures her mind, she stares at the dying kingpin, begging to know why he walked into the trap. His voice is a frail rasp, confessing he had to eliminate the threat permanently. Clinically speaking, sometimes securing lasting peace requires walking willingly into an absolute inferno. With a crimson grin, he confirms the rival is dead. It is a decisive victory. Yet, as the hidden surgical team bursts into the room, Emma breaks down, terrified that the ultimate price for her survival was his very life. Today, you and I are going to unpack this sequence piece by piece. The scene dissolves into absolute frantic chaos. An underground medical team scrambles, demanding whole blood as they hurl Lucian onto a steel table. Emma is shoved aside, his grip violently tearing from hers, leaving bright red streaks across her pale skin, the physical manifestation of a severed psychological lifeline. As mortality shadows his face, he chokes out her name. She snatches his hand back, her voice fracturing as she anchors herself to him. They sprint down opulent corridors toward a hidden trauma suite. The brutal psychological lesson here is that gilded mansions are never truly homes, only elaborate cages hiding deep rot. The surgeon physically blocks the heavy doors, and Lucian uses his final, agonizing breath to order her to stay behind. Emma vibrates with the primal urge to tear those heavy hinges apart, but the fractured look in his fading eyes paralyzes her. Even bleeding out, he attempts to shield her psyche from the severe trauma of watching him be cut open. She grips his freezing fingers, weeping as she commands him to fight. He whispers a broken vow to return. The steel doors slam shut. Emma is left isolated in the dim hallway, obsessively staring at the drying rust on her skin. A scarred security guard emerges from the shadows, gently urging her to sit. We must accept that the hardest human battle is sitting helplessly while random fate flips a coin. She tries to maintain her psychological armor, but her nervous system is in full shock. The guard admits the blade risked massive internal bleeding, but swears his boss refuses to lose. Her legs finally surrender. The guard Marcus offers a dry joke that half the syndicate shares his name, praising her rapid behavioral response. Emma cannot look away from her stained hands, feeling hollow. Marcus notes she held her ground instead of dissociating. Her unwavering devotion to the man whose world endangered her perfectly mirrors what we clinically observe as Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim falls helplessly in love with the architect of their captivity, much like the tragic case of Luca. She confesses that watching her mother fade in hospital beds gave her the worst kind of conditioning. The clinical truth is that past trauma never cures present pain. It merely trains us to mask our panic. Marcus admits no one adapts to violence, they simply become better actors. Agonizing hours drag forward. Stick with me here, because this is where the emotional dam breaks. Caleb appears drained of color in the harsh corridor light. Emma instantly collapses into her brother, her fragile psychological composure finally shattering. She weeps violently. Caleb offers no empty platitudes, simply wrapping his arms around her. Clinically, it proves that when a human psyche is actively fragmenting, a steady physical presence is worth far more than spoken words. Catching her breath, she whispers the terrifying scale of the ambush. Caleb squeezes her trembling fingers. Beyond these walls, the city wakes up blind to an underworld king battling death because he refused to abandon his human anchor. At 9:47, the heavy doors unlatch. The surgeon steps out, his scrubs painted red. Against all medical logic, the behavioral anomaly is alive. Lucian is completely stable. You and I are going to analyze the sheer, crashing wave of nervous system relief that forces Emma to her knees. Granted a strict 5-minute clinical window, she slips into the sterile room. Seeing Lucian stripped of his imposing behavioral armor provides a jarring, psychological contrast. Tethered to rhythmic monitors, the most feared man in the city suddenly looks entirely fragile. She drags a heavy metal chair to the bedside, pressing his pale hand against her wet cheek. She calls him an absolute fool, weeping as she thanks him for surviving. In response, his cold fingers offer a faint, miraculous motor twitch. A profound emotional tether can clearly reach through the thickest neurological fog of unconsciousness. The guards leave her in absolute peace. Severe exhaustion eventually pulls her into a dreamless sleep. Hours later, she snaps awake to a warm hand brushing her hair. You and I have probably both made this clinical error, judging a subject's blazing anger without recognizing the absolute terror hiding beneath it. The sterile room is swallowed by the cold light of late afternoon. Yet there is Lucien. His dark eyes are tracking her sharply. He manages a raspy greeting. She tells him his body looks like a walking corpse when he offers a weak smirk slowly. He lifts a heavy hand to trace her jawline. When he asks the time, she whispers he was unconscious for 18 agonizing hours. Medical staff labeled his survival an anomaly, but Emma boils with reactive rage over his reckless choice to fight 4 men alone. His expression instantly hardens. He states he would gladly take a bullet before letting an enemy touch her. We often project our fiercest anger onto the subjects we are deeply terrified of losing. Her fury melts away. The atmospheric pressure in the room grows heavy. Emma rests her forehead against his, carefully moving past the maze of intravenous lines. She begs him never to attempt a sacrificial behavioral stunt like that again. Lucien replies with a raspy vow to always fight to maintain a pulse. Sliding his heavy hand to her neck, he admits a truth that fractures his dark psychological framework. She means infinitely more to him than any criminal enterprise. Suddenly, the door violently swings open. Marcus fills the frame, completely stoic. A rival syndicate demands an immediate parley, explicitly naming Emma as the central bargaining chip. The room turns to absolute ice. Fighting past the agony of fresh sutures, Lucien forces himself upright. The bitter reality of absolute power is that your most fatal vulnerability will always be the innocent subjects you allow yourself to love. A severe wave of somatic nausea crashes over Emma, instantly draining the blood from her face. She scrambles to analyze what twisted psychological advantage the enemy could possibly hold over her. Lucien refuses to sit back and passively calculate. He swings his legs off the mattress, ignoring the frantic warnings of his physician. His voice returns to its familiar, commanding baseline. He orders a meeting in exactly 2 hours, demanding double the usual armed detail. Soon, he is dressed in pitch black and heavily armed. Emma observes how he favors his torn side, masking blinding neurological pain. She pleads with him to remain in bed, but he simply racks the slide of his pistol with chilling calm. He promises to eliminate anyone who uses her name as a threat. The truest measure of devotion is standing up to wage war, even when your own shattered biology is begging you to surrender. Lucien secures his heavy weapon, attempting to impose a classical isolation protocol by ordering her behind locked doors. Emma immediately rejects the parameter. She refuses to play the fragile bystander while he sheds blood to maintain her safety. If the opposition is weaponizing her traumatic history, she demands agency in the confrontation. A silent battle of dominant wills ensues until Lucien exhales a heavy breath of defeat, offering a rigid behavioral compromise. She will remain in the armored transport, stepping out only upon his definitive signal. As she takes his hand, she feels the involuntary physiological tremors racing through his veins. Ignoring the acute agony of his fresh wound, he pulls her close for a fierce kiss to her forehead. We must clinically accept that we cannot shield our subjects from the darkness forever. Let us open this psychological file together and observe how a controlled environment devolves into a fatal snare. The meeting occurs at an abandoned warehouse, a structural graveyard where syndicate anomalies are erased. Emma remains confined in the armored transport behind thick glass, watching Lucian disappear into the rusted entrance. He projects absolute dominance, yet she alone catalogues the subtle drag of his injured leg. The ensuing minutes act as systematic psychological torture. Suddenly, her phone vibrates with a demand to enter unescorted, or her brother is executed. She desperately rationalizes it as a bluff until a second message induces a visceral panic response. Life dictates a cold behavioral truth here. The exact moment we assume our attachments are clinically secure is precisely when the darkest variables strike. A visual stimulus loads on her screen, and the cognitive foundation of Emma's reality shatters. It is an image of her brother Caleb, a firearm resting against his skull. She is briefly swallowed by a deafening neurological terror that mutes all external stimuli. Yet, when she speaks, her vocal register is completely stripped of panic. She informs the guards she is exiting the vehicle. When an enforcer attempts a physical barricade, Emma slams the device against his chest, threatening an auditory escalation severe enough to summon local law enforcement. The guard experiences cognitive hesitation, then allows his unit to flank her as she sprints toward the decaying structure. Life demonstrates a brutal clinical reality in such moments. Sometimes, willingly walking into the epicenter of destruction is the only methodology for extracting family from the wreckage. The warehouse functions as a cold psychological tomb where broken lights cast fragmented shadows. Trapped inside are Lucian and Marcus, surrounded by armed operatives. While Caleb sits paralyzed at the center, Lucian aggressively commands Emma to retreat. Instead, a figure in a tailored suit emerges from the gloom, exhibiting classic malignant narcissism as he mocks her panic. Emma begs the subject to take her instead, but he counters with a calculated revelation. Her recent assault was merely a diagnostic stress test to fracture her carefully constructed persona. He has identified the phantom she was prior to her mother's death. Emma experiences acute vascular constriction. We must observe this fundamental trait of human behavior. You can alter your geographic coordinates endlessly, but the pathology of an unhealed trauma will perpetually track your movements. Emma attempts to maintain her false identity, but the antagonist emits a sociopathic smirk. He clinically details an old incident where a wealthy executive perished in a localized blaze. Utilizing silence as a manipulative tool, he drops the psychological ordnance. It was a deliberate act of arson. The spatial orientation seems to warp for Emma, as he asserts she was merely 9 when she initiated the combustion, executing a trauma-induced vengeance for her abused mother. He presents a degraded news clipping as empirical proof. Emma issues a weak verbal denial, but the rival weaponizes anomalous birth records to expose her lifetime of structural deception. Caleb stares at his sister, exhibiting the raw devastation of cognitive betrayal. This validates a heavy truth. The most destructive psychological weights we carry are the fundamental facts we actively conceal from those we protect. Caleb exhibits severe physiological tremors, interrogating his sibling about the stranger's data. Emma suffers immediate vocal paralysis. She attempts to formulate a rationale, but the antagonist overrides hers, formally classifying her as a lethal incendiary. Lucian observes her with a micro-expression of profound dissonance, silently pleading for a contradiction. Emma attempts to vocalize, but the denial aborts in her larynx. she softly confesses the historical data, explaining her chronological age of 9 and the extreme physical abuse inflicted upon her mother. The rival intercepts the narrative, diagnosing 3 separate ignition points as calculated malice. He frames her as an apex predator mimicking a victim, triggering Lucian's explosive territorial aggression. This presents a stark clinical reminder. A singular, unfiltered impulse of defensive rage possesses the structural capacity to permanently rewrite a human identity. Lucian attempts to invalidate the historical data, but the rival outlines a legal contingency plan involving a primed prosecutor. He demands 50% of Lucian's organizational assets. Capitulation guarantees Emma's data erasure, while refusal activates her murder charge, institutionalizes Caleb, and incinerates Lucian's infrastructure. The psychological gravity is absolute. Emma grips a rusted structural support, fighting total neurological collapse. 15 years of hypervigilance. Attempting to neurotically scrub the phantom olfactory trace of smoke from her epidermis has culminated in systemic failure. Her vocal cords fracture as she begs Lucian to retain his empire rather than save her. We observe a foundational truth here. An organism can construct a highly functional existence over a suppressed trauma, but the underlying psychological fault line will inevitably fracture. Let us analyze the interpersonal dynamics occurring in this psychological beat. Emma exhibits total ego collapse, begging for legal submission. Lucian ignores the hostile ballistics aimed at his chest, demanding sustained eye contact. Emma anticipates a reaction of moral revulsion, yet there is no clinical disgust in his gaze. He merely observes a severely fractured subject who has falsely diagnosed herself as irredeemable. He quietly requests the unedited narrative. Emma complies, vocalizing through severe emotional distress. Her motive was purely psychological deterrence against her mother's abuser. She placed ignition sources, but the combustion accelerated uncontrollably. She catalogues the exact neurological timestamp when she perceived her own mutation into a predator. This highlights a tragic cognitive reality. When an individual attempts to incinerate their own psychological demons, the residual radiation typically consumes the ovum. Lucian reframes her trauma, establishing her juvenile survival as the sole relevant metric. He initiates a terminal negotiation matrix, instructing the antagonist to release the sibling, incinerate the forensic data, and walk away breathing. The tailored subject openly mocks Lucian's destabilized hierarchy. As Lucian's hand drifts toward his holster, he clinically corrects the rival's cognitive distortion. The antagonist is not there to negotiate. His termination is already scheduled. Immediate environmental chaos initiates. The stranger applies maximum kinetic pressure to Caleb's cranium with his firearm. Lucian's motor control remains perfectly static, guaranteeing that any muscular contraction on that trigger lid will result in a collective localized extinction event. In this frozen temporal space, Emma computes the harshest psychological algorithm, securing your biological attachments, mandates the execution of a brutal behavioral sacrifice that standard human variants cannot process. Observe the behavioral dysregulation unfolding here. Emma initiates a high-velocity sprint directly toward the active ballistic threat, demonstrating a complete suppression of her organic survival instincts. Lucian emits a visceral, uncalibrated distress signal, fueled by an acute epinephrine surge. She violently extracts the wheelchair from the trajectory of the firearm. The antagonist experiences cognitive overload and discharges a singular, catastrophic projectile. Initially, Her nervous system fails to interpret the tissue damage, registering only a massive kinetic displacement before her gravitational collapse. Emma stares vacantly at the defective lighting, clinically analyzing the rapid thermal drop in her damaged quadrant. Lucian physically collapses beside her, his impenetrable sociopathic armor completely disintegrating as he begs for her survival. This isolates the profound reality of altruistic action. The ultimate sacrifice never offers a preliminary warning phase. It simply activates in the microscopic temporal void between autonomic cardiac contractions. Environmental auditory input degrades into white neurological static. She registers the intense mechanical pressure of Lucian's hands compressing her traumatized respiratory cavity. His vocal parameters fracture entirely as he forbids her from executing a terminal altruistic maneuver. Subsequently, her consciousness undergoes a hard systemic reboot. When cognitive function resumes, it introduces a terrifying matrix of somatic agony. Every inhalation simulates the ingestion of pulverized glass. A clinically detached medical professional details how the projectile induced a pulmonary collapse, noting her statistical anomaly in avoiding the morgue. Paralyzed beneath the sterile illumination, Emma's cognitive processing isolates a singular variable. She forces a highly abrasive vocalization to verify Caleb's status, and the physician confirms his security. Let us examine the mechanics of this phenomenon together. When physiological systems trend toward failure, an authentic psychological attachment operates as the ultimate tether, retracting the subject from the absolute precipice. The physician casually categorizes her behavior as heroic, an external trigger that unleashes a violent flood of traumatic memory recall. The industrial facility, the ballistic discharge. She experiences immediate autonomic panic, attempting to sit up while demanding Lucian's location. The doctor applies downward pressure, dispensing a massive influx of operational data. Lucian is currently engaged in a systematic organizational purge, permanently neutralizing anyone exposed to her classified profile. Emma processes the collateral metric of 7 operatives terminated solely to maintain her respiration. A depleted vocal signature emanates from the threshold. Lucian occupies the doorway, exhibiting the accelerated cellular degradation of a decade condensed into a single nocturnal cycle. His garments remain saturated with her oxidized hemoglobin, his ocular response hollowed by acute stress disorder. This presents a stark diagnostic image. The most crushing psychological weights we manage are inevitably those we deliberately strap to our own neurology to insulate the targets of our pathological devotion. The medical personnel withdraw, leaving an echoing, suffocating silence in the clinical space. The apex predator, Lucian, exhibits severe physical depletion as he approaches her bed. He drops the hammer, a blunt instrument of his violence, with a hollow thud. For 15 years, this female subject evaded a homicide charge, allowing him to orchestrate a bloody territorial war. He realizes now that she was merely a terrified juvenile, engaging in extreme protective violence to shield her maternal figure from a verifiable monster. She weeps, claiming her youth provides no excuse, but his narcissistic pathology shatters upon seeing her raw vulnerability. Let us examine this together. We frequently diagnose and deduce individuals by their darkest transgressions, failing to see they were merely executing the only tragic survival protocol they possessed. The subject paces the room like a caged predator. She constructed an immaculate phantom identity, and now this megalomaniacal narcissist is scrubbing biological evidence from his hands. Emma deteriorates into severe weeping, whispering that she will vanish. This triggers a catastrophic response. His vocal tenor fractures. He cares nothing for her historical homicides. His fury stems from the reality that she withheld data, while his emotional attachment formed against every survival instinct he possesses. He decimated rival factions just to secure her. And the clinical diagnosis? He would repeat the cycle. True loyalty in this aberrant environment is simply locating a partner whose deepest psychological chaos you are fully willing to manage. Emma decompensates, stating she is an irredeemable killer. Yet, the narcissist refuses to let her accept that narrative. He drops down, clinically reframing her severe trauma. He labels her a resilient survivor who sustained impossible cognitive loads. She begs him to sever the attachment. Instead, he brushes a tear from her face, declaring his permanent fixation on her pathology. Then he reveals the operational reality. He eradicated her historical footprint, purchasing a clean slate with 3 human casualties. Emma is utterly devastated. You and I must analyze this dark paradox carefully. In the violent spectrum of human attachment, the deepest charter bonds frequently demand the most unforgiving sacrifices to sustain the fragile illusion of a shared existence. The subject initiates close proximity, reinforcing the trauma bond by validating her worth against the body count. But his megalomania requires absolute compliance. He cannot sustain this violence if she continuously inserts herself into the kill zone. Emma rationalizes her behavior, claiming she was shielding Caleb. The narcissist instantly deconstructs her martyr complex. He identifies her sacrifice as a designed mechanism for self-destruction. For 15 years, she has exhibited severe avoidance, terrified of dependency. He dismantles her defenses, noting she would rather absorb ballistic trauma than request psychological support. Ultimately, our most courageous exterior acts are frequently just elaborate defensive masks hiding our deepest unspoken terrors. We observe his stress through blanching knuckles and a restricted vocal effect. He demands she cease her isolated heroics, which reliably result in medical trauma. Emma attempts to reconstruct her dissociative barriers, but the psychological architecture is utterly failing. She displays total systemic burnout from chronic hypervigilance. Lucian lowers his center of gravity, anchoring her erratic focus with sustained eye contact. He dictates the immediate cessation of her active flight response. She can no longer process this crushing trauma in a vacuum. The clinical reality of human behavior is quite striking. Sometimes the absolute bravest cognitive choice a person can make is to disengage their defensive mechanisms and simply allow themselves to be stabilized by another. He calculates that her surrender of autonomy is essential. True vulnerability requires far more neural resilience than simply engaging an external threat. Emma processes this predator through a dissociative lens. He initiated a catastrophic conflict on her behalf, cementing a powerful trauma bond. Finally, she articulates her core terror. She anticipates his idealization will shatter, reducing her to a regressed juvenile prone to violent errors. In a display of behavioral reinforcement, Lucian pulls her close, swearing permanent attachment. The emotional dam collapses entirely. Emma fractures into unregulated weeping. We all inevitably approach this critical threshold. Complete systemic fragmentation is often the mandatory prerequisite for genuine psychological reconstruction. As the emotional discharge concludes, she reverts to conditioning, requesting their next tactical maneuver. But the narcissist alters the paradigm. Displaying anomalous gentleness, He establishes physical recovery as their primary objective. He assures her the cartel surveillance is neutralized. Exhibiting textbook Stockholm dependency, Emma leans into him, desperate to validate this fragile cessation of hostilities. Outside, the dawn illuminates two severely traumatized subjects acting as mutual survival mechanisms. Her erratic cardiac rhythm finally synchronizes with his. The clinical takeaway remains profoundly human. Regardless of the severe psychological pathology in our past chapters, every individual retains a fundamental right to experience the healing warmth of a new morning. She assimilates into his respiratory cadence, using him as a somatic anchor amidst her turbulences. He states that this attachment is permanent. For the first time, the prospect of prolonged confinement does not a flight response. Relinquishing her hypervigilant control paradoxically simulates absolute freedom. As the monitor's rhythm induces a hypnagogic state, the narcissist verbalizes an affection that ignores her violent history. Exhaustion pulls her under before she can respond. Let us examine this, you and I. True attachment never audits the lingering ghosts of a dark past. Yet environmental stability in this lifestyle is a fleeting illusion. Without warning, a catastrophic shockwave of shattering glass violently terminates their brief psychological regulation. In a microsecond, their fragile architecture of safety is violently deconstructed. Her ocular response is instantaneous, accompanied by severe physiological distress in her damaged lungs. The room is plunged into darkness, illuminated only by lunar refraction across pulverized glass. A visceral vocalization of terminal trauma penetrates Isla's, suppressing agonizing pain. She forces her compromised body upright just as the door is breached. Marcus invades the space with a drawn firearm, initiating a catastrophic threat protocol. A hostile tactical unit of 20 armed combatants is actively hunting her. This sequence illustrates a cold behavioral absolute. When authentic lethal stimuli manifest in the dead of night, an organism instantly discovers the true evolutionary capacity of its raw survival mechanisms. Marcus extracts Emma through the corridor. Neural pain floods her fractured ribs, but her primitive limbic system overrides all cognitive functions. Heavy boots reverberate proximally. Rounding a blind intersection, they intercept two enemy operatives. Exhibiting zero hesitation, Marcus terminates both threats with ballistic efficiency. He propels Emma forward, providing the bunker sequence and mandating her isolation. Then, this conditioned protector executes a conscious pivot, stepping directly into a lethal environment to procure her a few precious seconds. The psychological data here is written in blood. Authentic loyalty is never validated in a comfortable baseline state. It is proven the millisecond an individual willingly inserts themselves into an active kill zone on your behalf. She breaches the threshold motor control compromised by adrenaline as she inputs the sequence. The titanium locks engage with absolute finality. Within this bunker, illuminated by surveillance monitors, Caleb and Clara exhibit textbook catatonia. Caleb demands situational data. Emma attempts to project control, assuring him their safety is absolute. Suddenly, a kinetic shockwave destabilizes the perimeter. On the feeds, the eastern quadrant is consumed by a thermal event. Emma hyperfocuses on the grid, locating the megalomaniac on level 3. He is pinned down, exchanging lethal ballistic force. Let us look at this closely. Observing your primary attachments engage in terminal violence from an impenetrable sanctuary induces the most paralyzing form of learned helplessness a mind can endure. The subject is paralyzed by the surveillance monitors, Every shot the narcissist executes is calculated, yet his probability of survival is collapsing. Caleb demonstrates severe dysregulation, raging against their concealment. Emma articulates the clinical reality that exiting ensures immediate termination. Caleb projects a look of betrayal, diagnosing her complicit observation of their protectors dying. The accusation penetrates her armor because it is factual. On screen, Lucian retreats to the staircase, garments saturated with blood. His spatial options are exhausted. We have likely analyzed the pathology of survivor's guilt together. The lesson is absolute. Sometimes, preservation mandates sittings in total silence, while others liquidate their existence to purchase your safety. Let us open the case file on Emma. Watch how she responds to the suffocating isolation of the bunker. She faces a brutal psychological trigger. Staying hidden means Lucian, her captor and lover, perishes. Clara begs her to stay put, but Emma's pathology is already set. She drives a steel chair through the weapons cabinet, obliterating her own safety. Caleb pleads with her, terrified, yet as she racks the slide of a handgun, we see the absolute grip of Stockholm Syndrome. Her trauma bond dictates that the highest form of courage is refusing to let your abuser face the darkness alone. Caleb recognizes this unyielding resolve. The behavioral contagion is instant, and he chooses to ride into the fire beside her. Notice the defiance as Caleb pushes his wheelchair forward. Emma attempts to block his path, projecting the role of protector, but he shatters her cognitive distortion. He confesses he knows everything. The childhood fire, the life she took at 9 years old, and the decades spent fleeing. Tears stream down his face. He is not angry at her violent history, but furious she carried that agonizing psychological weight in total isolation. She claimed her secrecy was a shield, but Caleb clinically dismantles that defense mechanism. The devastating lesson here is undeniable. Hiding our deepest traumas from our family never keeps them safe. It merely leaves everyone drowning in their own isolated silence. Her armor stripped, Emma collapses. Emma accepts this grim reality, though the environmental threat remains suffocating. Wheeling a paralyzed man into a crossfire is a statistical death sentence. Yet Caleb reaches for a weapon, declaring that family watches out for each other. For years, Emma faced the predators alone. In this heavy, clinical beat, she finally drops the delusion that she does not require intervention. She readies his gun and commands him to stay behind her. Clara pleads from the corner, paralyzed by the raw terror of open graves. As Emma checks her magazine, we must remember a profound truth. Accepting help does not indicate psychological weakness. It provides the absolute strength to walk directly into the fire. She pushes the heavy oak door open. You and I are going to unpack this next sequence together because it perfectly illustrates human endurance. They slip into the corridor, moving like phantoms through the thick smoke. The estate has devolved into a complete combat zone, the walls chewed by lead and fire consuming the wings. Emma pulls Caleb back from a fallen guard. Suddenly, her surgical wound tears open. Hot blood soaks her shirt, but her adrenaline overrides the trauma. That sometimes intense physical pain is just a brutal biological reminder that you are alive enough to keep fighting. They creep to the grand staircase and peer over the edge. Down below, Lucian and his remaining enforcers are trapped in a desperate defensive circle, firing with the agonizing hesitation of dead men. Caleb whispers a desperate need for a distraction, and Emma targets the heavy chandelier hanging above the foyer. She asks if he can make the shot. Bracing against his wheelchair, Caleb exhales and fires, Misses by mere inches. Instantly, the gunmen snap their aim toward the balcony. Emma violently yanks his chair backward just as the air fills with flying lead. The marble disintegrates, missing her by a fraction. The reality of basic survival instinct is painted clearly here. When a calculated plan falls apart, you never freeze, you move. She drags Caleb behind a thick column. Slicing through the roaring gunfire, she hears Lucian. The narcissist has broken his own defensive circle, fighting his way up the crumbling stairs to reclaim his possession. Lucien moves sluggishly, weighed down by severe physical exhaustion, but his eyes lock onto Emma with the terrifying, insane intensity of a megalomaniac losing his grip. Knowing he would die trying to reach the top alone, Emma steps from cover and opens fire. The brutal recoil nearly knocks her flat. Her lungs scream, but she pulls the trigger until the chamber clicks empty. It buys him the exact seconds he needs. Lucian violently shoves her behind the pillar, using his own body as a physical shield. He demands to know what she is doing, his voice cracking with absolute terror. True devotion often defies all clinical logic, compelling us to step directly into the line of fire. Emma touches his bruised face, sarcastically noting their mutual failure to stay out of harm. A broken laugh rips from his throat. He pulls her in for a desperate kiss, tasting of blood, bitter ash, and the terrifying reality of their mortality. He confesses his love, instantly followed by raging anger that she risked her life. It is classic narcissistic projection. Emma just smiles, fumbling to reload. Lucian peers around the marble column, deciding they will make a dash for the garage. He is leaving his mansion to burn. Emma is clinically stunned. This place was the very foundation of his entire empire, yet he swears he would let his whole world turn to ash to keep her breathing. We often learn what truly matters only when our artificial empires are violently stripped away. Grabbing Caleb's wheelchair, they bolt into the chaotic crossfire. Lucian pushes Caleb's chair with one arm while firing with the other. Emma sprints alongside, blindly shooting to hold the hitmen back. They tear past the rooms where she once existed as an invisible ghost in his twisted empire. The steel garage door looms ahead. Suddenly, Marcus materializes from the thick smoke. Bleeding from a severe head wound, he plants his feet and unleashes a wall of suppressing fire. Lucian punches the security code, violently shoving Caleb and Emma inside. As Marcus turns to follow, a round catches him in the spine. He collapses, completely still. Emma screams, fighting the grip of her trauma bond to run back into the crossfire. But Lucian grabs her, drags her inside, and slams the heavy door shut with the cold finality of a tomb. The sensory chaos of this psychological break is overwhelming. Emma is devastated, screaming at Lucian for abandoning his loyal soldier. But Lucian remains perfectly rigid. He operates on the cold, sociopathic math of survival. Stick with me here, because the hardest part of surviving a war is deciding whose body gets left in the dirt. While Emma shakes from acute trauma, Lucian secures Caleb into the armored truck. As they speed away, she watches his empire go up in flames in the rearview mirror. Here is a haunting life lesson. Sometimes you have to let your entire carefully constructed castles burn to the absolute ground just to keep your family breathing. Power means nothing when you are dead. He floors the gas pedal, and the mansion detonates behind them. The engine roars as Emma watches the physical manifestation of his ego turn into a smoking ashtray. In the back, Caleb is panicked, demanding to know their destination. Lucian rips the wheel around a sharp corner and delivers a chilling promise. They are heading to a Brooklyn safe house to prepare a bloodbath. We have to analyze the heartbreaking irony embedded in this tragedy. The shadowy figure who ordered this hit is the exact same patriarch who took Lucien off the streets and molded his criminal mind. The life lesson here is deeply brutal. The most fatal backstabs never come from strangers lurking in the dark. The worst bites always come from the exact mentors who taught you how to survive. Now, the grieving student is gearing up for calculated slaughter. The dark Manhattan streets blur past, and the atmosphere inside the truck is psychologically suffocating. Emma is deeply traumatized. The mansion is gone, Marcus is dead, and her reality is fractured. But watch Lucien's face. He has flipped a dark cognitive switch. He tells her, you do not walk away from a trauma of this magnitude. You either strike back with overwhelming force, or you end up buried. Emma looks at his cold expression and realizes the gentle man she projected onto him never existed. In his place sits a megalomaniac, ready to drown the city streets in blood. It reveals a harsh psychological truth. People will show you exactly who they are when their back is against the wall, and you better believe them. The inescapable cycle of violence begins again. Emma whispers, she wants no part in this upcoming slaughter, attempting to assert a healthy boundary. Lucien looks at her with absolute ice in his veins and delivers an unyielding ultimatum. They are about to execute the total wipeout of everyone who crossed them. If she cannot stomach the ugly reality of his pathology, she needs to walk away right now. He promises to keep her physically safe, but refuses to apologize for his monstrous nature. He demands she stop projecting a hero complex onto a criminal kingpin. The lesson carries immense, haunting weight. Sometimes surviving the darkest nights means tossing your pristine morals out the window and aligning with the monster. Completely consumed by her Stockholm syndrome, Emma leans into his touch and chooses to stay. Let us examine the environmental triggers in this underground garage. The concrete is cold, isolating. Subject Emma exhibits the classic flight response, a desperate urge to grab Caleb and flee. But we must understand her baseline trauma, a childhood violently fractured at age 9. Normalcy is a neurological myth for her. Enter Lucien, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, yet he anchors her reality. He looked at her psychological ruin and remained. The clinical takeaway for us is simple. You must stop chasing a fabricated peace and anchor to those willing to stand beside us in the mud. She grips his freezing hand, her flight response neutralized. Her only plea is a trauma bargain. When the adrenaline fades, she needs him to construct a reality that does not require burying bodies. Observe the micro-expressions under the flickering light. Lucien offers a rigid nod, a fraction of a concession, though Emma subconsciously knows it is the only psychological mercy she will extract. Caleb is wheeled down the decaying corridor to room 304. Inside, 3 enforcers display the raw, unmedicated pathology of cornered predators. An older subordinate reduces the violent arithmetic. 8 allies deceased, 16 targets remaining. It highlights a brutal but necessary principle of survival. Never consolidate your entire safety net in a single vulnerable location. Lucien is a master of compartmentalization. His assets remain completely off the grid, untouched. With this hidden leverage, he is preparing to finance an absolute tidal wave of human destruction. Let us study Lucien in his element. The blue light washes over his completely unblinking face. He initiates a mass casualty event with the flat effect of a man doing mundane paperwork. Emma experiences severe somatic distress. She begs him to spare the civilian workers who inevitably absorb the stray gunfire. Yet, the narcissist shows zero emotional variance. In his transactional reality, Human collateral is merely an operational expense. Caleb sits paralyzed by the magnitude of the impending slaughter. There is a deeply tragic reality we must confront here. When a fractured mind decides to burn the environment for retribution, the resulting fire almost always incinerates the innocent bystanders who never asked to be part of the equation. Emma pivots to flee, but Lucien physically intercepts her wrist. He clinically registers the terror fracturing her psyche before releasing her with a burner phone. She forces the rooftop door open. The freezing air hits her lungs, and her physical form collapses under acute survivor guilt. She observes the city glowing red, internalizing the false belief that this violence exists, solely because she draws breath. Then, the heavy door groans. Caleb pushes his wheelchair through the cold, parking securely by her side. You and I can see the core psychological truth at play. When the cognitive floor drops out from beneath you, a single familiar presence prevents total collapse. Extreme trauma acts as a social filter, isolating exactly who will sit with you in the ashes of your life. The emotional suppression fails, and Emma completely shatters. Her voice fragments as she begs for Caleb to forgive her, exhibiting profound shame for dragging him into this blood-soaked environment. Caleb, however, displays no autonomic arousal. He does not flinch. He reaches out and secures her shaking hand. Staring at the emergency sirens, he states his emotional base slightly. He would rather evade lethal threats with her than endure a sterile, isolated existence. He understands the fatal statistics of this conflict, and he refuses to withdraw. It provides us with a stark behavioral lesson. Authentic human connection is not about fleeing when the environment becomes hostile. It is the conscious choice to grip your partner tighter when the rain turns into falling glass. Caleb forces eye contact, dismantling her psychological denial. The assassins will pursue them until biological death occurs. Fascinatingly, Caleb refuses to pathologize Lucien. To him, the megalomaniac is a necessary apex predator keeping them breathing, but Emma is cognitively depleted. She whispers that she cannot integrate this violent reality. Caleb grounds her with a highly pragmatic directive. She does not need to accept it. She merely has to endure the immediate threat. If she survives the current neurological crisis, perhaps she can deprogram Lucien later. It is a severe clinical reality we all face. When your structural stability fails, surviving the next 24 hours is a total victory. You can never suture the mind until you stop the physical bleeding. As dawn creates sharp contrast across the roof, we witness a profound cognitive shift. Emma inhales deeply. The acute panic attack subsides, replaced by a chilling emotional detachment. She returns Caleb to the operation center. Lucien is mathematically reviewing his termination list. Without a vocal tremor, Emma fully succumbs to the trauma bond. She actively volunteers to cross extreme ethical boundaries to secure their safety. Lucien pulls her close, reinforcing the reality that the violence will escalate. She accepts this. Her remaining neurological innocence disintegrates. Life constantly maneuvers us into these impossible psychological corners, teaching us a grim truth. Protecting our immediate tribe always demands a piece of our own soul as collateral. The morning light floods the room in an unforgiving arterial red. The anxious victim is eradicated, replaced by a hardened participant coordinating a lethal strategy. Over 72 hours, Lucien executes his narcissistic masterpiece. Emma monitors the digital feeds, observing the systematic dismantling of a rival structure. Day 1 incinerates enemy infrastructure. Day 2 liquidates their financial assets and neutralizes their muscle. By day 3, the opposing faction is biologically erased, while Lucian's unit remains intact. There is a deeply unsettling psychological lesson coded in this carnage. Occasionally, the only method to terminate the anxiety of being hunted is to adopt the traits of the predator. Stare into the dark and ignite the match yourself. 4 in the morning. The remaining variables are cornered in a decaying structure. Let us examine the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that precedes a total system failure. Lucian adjusts his tactical armor, his pupils dilated with the cold hyperfocus of a sociopath. Emma approaches, her vocal cords strained, pleading with him to delegate the execution. He does not offer a verbal response. He simply chambers around. His inflated grandiosity dictates that he must personally deliver the fatal blow to secure dominance. She attempts to leverage his prior promise of stability, but his brain only processes scorched earth. It proves a haunting behavioral truth. The massive defensive barriers we construct to insulate our loved ones are the exact same walls that trap them in the dark. Emma presents with acute motor tremors. Her speech fractures as she clarifies this casualty cascade was never her request. Lucian closes the distance, running a rough thumb against her jawline. In his disordered cognitive framework, mass extermination is his primary expression of romantic attachment. Emma is psychologically drowning, aware that his biochemical addiction to retaliation is a terminal condition. He presses his forehead to hers, promising permanence. Yet she understands the ruthless cycle. Retribution requires endless escalation. The diagnostic lesson is absolute. You must recognize the precise moment to disengage, because fighting a perpetual conflict will inevitably incinerate the very sanctuary you intended to preserve. Lucian grips her shoulders tightly. We finally observe the paranoid anxiety fracturing his megalomania. His delusion dictates that one surviving adversary guarantees her demise. Emma aggressively breaks physical contact. She challenges the logic of his violence, knowing the environment will simply generate a new threat for every enemy buried. She warns his empathy is actively eroding, leaving nothing but a hollow tactical instrument. He rationalizes the slaughter as a prerequisite for safety, ignoring that absolute securities is a clinical myth. She pleads with him to prioritize their bond over his rage. It offers a profound behavioral realization. Dominance is not the capacity to eradicate a city. Genuine psychological power is possessing the discipline to finally lower the weapon. Emma weeps, begging for behavioral de-escalation. Observe Lucian's physical rigidity. His brain is experiencing a severe conflict, the primitive compulsion to annihilate threats colliding with his desire to provide her stability. He severs visual contact. When he speaks, his tone is terrifyingly flat. He clinically admits his capacity for mercy is permanently deleted. He is an organism engineered purely for devastation. His self-diagnosis is absolute. He is the sociopathic entity willing to incinerate his own moral framework just to maintain her vital signs. Emma mentally collapses under this realization. This exposes a catastrophic truth regarding human attachment. In the obsessive pursuit to shield your deepest connection, it is dangerously easy to irreversibly terminate your own humanity. Let us open the clinical file on Lucian and Emma. We observe a profound behavioral paralysis. Lucian drifts toward the door, his posture devoid of affect. He murmurs that her biological survival is his only metric. Then Emma fractures the silence. A primal scream erupts, rooting his boots to the floor. Respiration does not equal living, she insists. Hiding is prolonged necrosis, and she refuses to let him excise his humanity. He turns, his facial muscles contorted in raw distress, demanding how he can entrust her survival to apex predators. She secures his trembling hands. To the clinical eye, this dynamic is fascinating. It teaches us a simple life lesson. Genuine change only begins the exact moment we discard our defensive armor and choose hope over deeply ingrained fear. Observe his features as he warns her of the severe vulnerabilities she demands. Emma remains an unmoving anchor, mandating that he prioritize the living woman in front of him. The resulting silence is an auditory vacuum. You and I are going to unpack this psychological fracture together. The rigid architecture of a megalomaniac narcissist completely shatters. With a bitter expletive, he tears away his vest, launching it against the drywall. He collapses, burying his face, weeping without restraint. He admits his entire empire was constructed through systematic terror. Emma kneels beside to demonstrating the paradoxical comfort found in Stockholm Syndrome. This reveals a simple life lesson. Sometimes the bravest action a human can take is allowing themselves to completely fall apart to protect a fragile new bond. Let us focus closely on the subjects. Emma leans toward him, acting as a grounding mechanism. She whispers that the brutal cognitive war is already won. Now arrives the terrifying phase, proving he possesses the psychological fortitude to disarm. Lucian goes entirely silent before his internal fortress crumbles. He pulls her into his lap, a hollow sob tearing through his chest. The architect of violence is laid bare. He verbally surrenders the final raid to his subordinates, warning that mercy often invites systemic ruin. She administers a soft kiss to his forehead. We extract a vital life lesson here. In true partnership means sharing the crushing psychological weight of the world. Stepping into the dark unknown is less terrifying when you do not navigate it alone. The kinetic assault unfolds far from his direct control. Emma monitors the pale security feeds, documenting his autonomic response as his grip crushes her hand. 17 minutes later, 8 adversaries are deceased. The territorial dispute concludes. Lucian executes 2 pivotal calls. One banishes the survivors. The other trades forensic data to a weary detective to erase his violent history. He terminates the connection, pulls Emma against his chest, and enters a state of minor catatonia. An hour passes in silence before Caleb locates them in the dark. Clinically speaking, walking away from your darkest behavioral patterns is never a clean break. It is a slow, exhausting exhale after holding your breath for your entire existence. That is a lesson we all must internalize. Caleb punctures the gloom, confirming a sterile perimeter. The grand estate is gutted, its structural integrity compromised by ballistics. Emma registers the severe muscular tension in Lucian as he processes the destruction of his narcissistic monuments. Through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome, she leans in, whispering that their new foundation will not rely on human collateral. Caleb advances his wheelchair, initiating the inquiry of their next phase. Lucian breaks his catatonia, running a fatigued hand through his hair. He proposes a sanitized penthouse, severed from his prior criminal networks. We observe a very practical life lesson here. Moving forward often dictates that we let our old toxic monuments burn to ground so we can finally perceive the clear sky above. Let us dissect this operational shift together, shall we? Lucian calculates that dismantling his pathological syndicate requires months of sustained effort. Emma observes his fatigued profile with fixation. The apex predator is vacating his hierarchy to ensure her environmental safety. When she hypothesizes his absence will generate new hostile actors, he exhibits a razor-sharp grimace. He is merely selecting a new theater of conflict. However, unresolved trauma invariably demands closure. The tension spikes when Caleb clears his throat, establishing direct eye contact with his sister. Emma experiences a visceral autonomic drop. Her brother demands empirical facts regarding her long deception, starting with that childhood incendiary event. The moment of absolute clinical reckoning has arrived. Observe the subject as she dismantles a decade of defensive fabrications. Her extremities display visible tremors as she details the chronic physical abuse they endured. She testifies that at 9 years of age, operating under acute stress, she ignited the accelerant that triggered the blaze. She catalogues the timeline of evasion, financial distress, and menial labor required for his survival. By her conclusion, Caleb is exhibiting silent lacrimation. Her vocal cords fail as she requests absolution. Caleb interrupts, instructing her to cease her apologies. She was a juvenile bearing an adult pathological load. Here is a fundamental life lesson. True forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply asks us to honor the heavy, brutal burdens our loved ones carried to keep us physically safe. The environmental stimuli soften as Caleb secures her trembling hands. He presents no hostility, only a profound melancholia that she processed this traumatic data in total isolation. When Emma insists her objective was threat mitigation, Caleb establishes an adult boundary, noting his age of 19. He has survived amputations, ballistic exchanges, and residential destruction. He does not perceive a sociopath. He observes a fiercely loyal guardian who surrendered her developmental years for his continuity. Initiating physical contact, he urges her to distribute the psychological load between him and Lucian. Lucian observes silently, giving the unit space to regulate. The lesson is undeniable. The bravest act of love is putting down your heavy armor and letting someone else hold the umbrella. Let us pause and analyze this dynamic. Emma stands, regulating her emotional output, positioned between her resilient sibling and the most lethal variable in their environment. Both regard her as their primary attachment figure. She articulates her deep paranoia of interpersonal trust, but Lucian steps forward, verifying his commitment to their shared rehabilitation. We transition to that afternoon. They enter a high-altitude, sunlit residence. Emma registers sensory overload, processing that a megalomaniac narcissist altered his behavioral matrix to provide her a stable sanctuary. This illustrates a compelling human paradox and a vital lesson. Sometimes the individuals most violently shattered by their environment are the exact ones equipped to meticulously reassemble your broken pieces. We observe the extreme elevation of the landscape as Lucan provides her a distilled spirit. Emma focuses on the glass barrier, verbalizing her chronic hypervigilance. She predicts an imminent failure of this stability. Lucian minimizes the physical distance, applying tactile pressure to her spine. He guarantees the permanence of this environment. When she interrogates their capacity to mimic neurotypical domesticity, he offers a knowing micro-expression. The deception phase has terminated. His assets are legitimized. Emma registers the activation of a cognitive pathway dormant for 15 years. Hope, you and I must recognize this lesson. You do not need an unblemished behavioral record to construct a beautiful future. You only require the courage to remain present. Project yourself onto the precipice of an unstructured future, aware the descent could induce trauma. Emma whispers his concept of systemic rehabilitation sounds improbable. Lucian sets down his glass. Maintaining intense ocular focus, he acknowledges the forthcoming neurological friction. He frames her face, expressing a desire to observe their baseline functioning once survival mode is deactivated. When she confirms her acute terror, his response is a profound psychological pivot. He proposes they experience the terror simultaneously. Their intimacy is no longer a struggle for dominance. It is rooted in the radical hypothesis that they finally possess time. The bravest action any trauma survivor can execute is dropping their defensive guard to love the person standing right in front of them. An involuntary laugh escapes Emma as she diagnoses their pairing as optimally dysfunctional. They maintain proximity as solar illumination fades. Below, the environment remains a chaotic stressor, but here, two conditioned subjects have secured an extinction of their threat response. Will this stability be linear? Unlikely. Pathological histories resist immediate erasure. Advancing the timeline 90 days, the profile indicates successful domestic habituation. Emma operates a brewing appliance, actively rewiring her neural pathways to accept normalcy. Caleb excels in his academic protocols. This solidifies a vital life lesson. Executing small, consistent behavioral modifications every single day ultimately constructs the most monumental psychological victories of our human experience. Let us examine their post-traumatic baseline. Caleb exhibits remarkable neuroplasticity facing the future with an unclouded affect. Lucian is systematically dismantling his syndicate, sacrificing editorial dominance to construct a legitimate reality is a profound behavioral pivot, yet severe trauma rarely evaporates. Emma suffers from night terrors of phantom flames. Lucian displays hyperarousal, jolting awake to grasp a non-existent weapon. Still, they demonstrate adaptive co-regulation. Lucian calmly intercepts a spatula from Emma, clinically noting she is incinerating their breakfast. They exchange light-hearted humor over silent smoke alarms. The psychological lesson is quite simple. Genuine rehabilitation is not the absolute erasure of the past, but the capacity to find shard within the unpredictable variables of daily life. Picture the clinical framing of this routine. Sunlight illuminates the domestic space as Lucian instructs her to sit. He retains the calibrated precision of an enforcer, yet channels that motor control into scrambling eggs. Emma observes from the counter, expressing a breathless laugh. She labels this peaceful stimuli as wonderfully weird. The cognitive imprint of her past trauma feels dormant. Suddenly, the baseline shifts. He sets the pan aside, utilizing direct, unyielding eye contact to bypass her defensive mechanisms. He states his intention to marry her. Emma enters an acute freeze response, her autonomic nervous system overwhelmed by the sudden stimulus. You and I must understand the volatility of the psyche here. Life possesses a startling capacity to invert our reality in a single heartbeat, and often the only viable coping mechanism is to brace for the impact. Confronted with the proposal, Emma psychologically fractures. She cites their brief 3-month history, her amygdala frantically seeking a flight response. Lucian remains rigid. His attachment formed the exact moment he witnessed her covered in blood, shielding her sibling, a powerful catalyst for trauma bonding. Emma spirals, identifying them both as broken organisms unfit for societal integration. Applying physical pressure across the counter, he grounds her reeling cognition. He recognizes her ingrained feelings of unworthiness, calmly reminding her that he dismantled a violent syndicate specifically to ensure her survival. She weeps over the lack of guaranteed peace. He draws her in, vowing to neutralize all future threats. The clinical truth is that genuine connection is never the illusion of a safe harbor. It is the mutual agreement to navigate severe turbulence as a cohesive unit. We can analyze this defensive hesitation, the profound terror of lowering psychological armor when environmental conditioning predicts a strike. Lucian exhibits remarkable restraint, avoiding demands for immediate compliance. He simply asks her to evaluate if their accumulated suffering has earned them stability. It exhibits paralysis, terrified of contaminating their sanctuary. Employing soothing physical contact, he promises they will untangle their complex trauma together. Evaluating this former apex predator who dismantled his own ecosystem for her safety, she agrees to process the request. His micro-expressions reveal profound relief. They embrace until the jarring vibration of a mobile device shatters their isolation. The observable lesson is undeniable. Peace is never a static, permanent destination. It is a daily, deliberate negotiation with the persistent chaos of the outside world. Observe the immediate physiological shift. As Emma checks the device, her spinal posture snaps rigid. Instantly, Lucian's ingrained survival instincts activate, shifting his mass to intercept a threat. However, the stimulus is benign, a correspondence offering a full scholarship to a university in New York. Lucian grips her shoulders, displaying intense positive reinforcement. Emma, conversely, spirals into an acute anxiety attack, stating she never submitted an application. He calmly admits to manipulating variables to secure her entry, though the academic execution remains hers. A structured, normal routine triggers more severe phobic responses in her than physical violence. You and I must recognize this clinical paradox. Surviving a traumatic environment is an act of pure autonomic endurance, but constructing a functional life requires an entirely different neurological courage. A close analysis of Emma's micro-expressions reveals profound terror. She is paralyzed by the fear that reintegrating into society will sever her complex, trauma-forged bond with this former syndicate leader. Lucian effectively decodes her visual cues and dismantles her anxiety, guaranteeing his support for her upward mobility. Healthy attachment, clinically speaking, never requires a subject to restrict their development to match a partner's pathology. It provides the psychological oxygen for expansion. Overwhelmed by this unprecedented emotional safety, Emma anchors herself to his collar, initiating a desperate kiss. Her respiration heavy, she requests he repeat his marriage proposal. She delivers a definitive affirmative. Lucian elevates her off the ground, exhibiting an uncharacteristic burst of uninhibited joy, just as the juvenile Caleb enters the observable environment. The juvenile subject diffuses the heightened emotional state, noting Lucian had previously requested his formal approval. Emma evaluates the males, who now constitute her primary support system, acknowledging that a legal document will simply codify their established dynamic. Caleb supplies a vital cognitive reframe. Their familial bond is already absolute. The legal contract merely erects a systemic barrier against external disruption. Her anticipatory anxiety regarding the future finally transforms into secure expectation. Exactly 6 months later, they are positioned inside a Manhattan courthouse. The environment is devoid of underworld stimuli. We are simply observing two severely fractured psyches constructing a stable framework. The empirical truth is that genetics rarely dictate true kinship. A functional family is merely the conscious decision to endure adversity together. Let us examine the variables of this courtroom setting together. The subjects stand before a magistrate who clinically articulates the foundational burdens of a legal union. He notes the biological impulse to initiate a flight response when psychological pain peaks, concluding that successful bonding demands deliberate ground-holding. Emma utilizes physical touch, her fingers tracking the violent scar tissue on his hand, establishing prolonged eye contact. She processes his violent history alongside the obsessive devotion trauma that reprogrammed his behavior. Her vocalization of the vows registers zero hesitation, matching the calculated cadence of Lucian's own voice. Upon the legal pronouncement, Lucian executes a kiss that isolates them from all external stimuli. Within that physical compression, Emma finally synthesizes the neurochemical joy her trauma had previously blocked. Following the audible celebration from Caleb, Emma experiences a significant psychological realignment. A deeply fractured neural pathway seems to reset, resulting in a profound baseline of calm. The behavioral data presents a clear lesson. True psychological peace is never just the absence of external conflict. It is the solid, cognitive certainty of having a reliable co-regulator during periods of extreme distress. They consume a meal entirely absent of hypervigilance or syndicate paranoias. Observing Caleb display uninhibited joy stimulates a massive release of oxytocin in Emma's system. Later, in their elevated residence, Lucian physically transports her across the threshold. He employs a gentle tactile precision that fundamentally contradicts his previous identity as a brutal enforcer. Syncing her respiration to his cardiac rhythm, Emma achieves absolute, verifiable safety. Document the stark behavioral contrast here. Lucian, an individual whose previous operational model relied entirely on applied terror, now actively solicits his partner's internal distress. Emma verbalizes a lingering cognitive dissonance. She is terrified their current tranquility is merely a statistical anomaly, waiting for violent correction. Lucian avoids offering hollow, pacifying platitudes. Instead, he utilizes realistic forecasting. He confirms that environmental fractures will inevitably occur, but establishes they will process that chaos as a synchronized unit. They are two traumatized organisms executing a mutual survival strategy. The clinical diagnosis of deep connection is not the pathological denial of systemic wreckage. It is simply securing a partner fully willing to kneel in the dirt and sort through the hazardous debris by your side. A longitudinal follow-up after 12 months reveals a fascinating psychological resolution. Emma navigates a university stage. The subject, forced into lethal violence at age 9 to ensure sibling survival, is now acquiring formal education credentials. Observing from the crowd, Lucian and Caleb vocalize massive positive reinforcement, completely disregarding social decorum. Emma exhibits a lacrimal response. This emotional discharge is a logical reaction to successfully exiting a high-mortality criminal ecosystem. During their private celebration, Caleb praises her refusal to let severe trauma eradicate her core empathy. The final lesson drawn from this case file is quite simple. The ultimate manifestation of power is never the systematic destruction of hostile targets, but the deliberate, exhausting process of psychological reconstruction. Let us observe the aftermath of this specific trauma cycle. Emma deflects the survivor praise to Caleb, honoring the grueling physical therapy he endured. Caleb smiles, acknowledging she was the psychological compass, guiding them through their darkest cognitive nights. Beneath the table, Lucian firmly grips her hand. The solid gold of her wedding band serves as a silent grounding mechanism, anchoring her nervous system to present reality. Later that evening, they stand on a balcony, observing the city lights. We know countless individuals move through those streets, fighting invisible wars of complex trauma. The labor required to heal from deep psychological lacerations is an unglamorous grind. Yet, the ultimate revelation is this. When you finally reach the summit, the quiet clarity of the view makes every brutal scar feel necessary because they led you straight into the light. Watching them stand against the quiet skyline, we observe a fascinating psychological baseline. Lucian asks if she harbors any regret over the violent trauma they endured. Emma exhibits zero hesitation. Her response is clinically significant. She feels no remorse because they did not just survive the syndicate's suffocating grip. They dismantled its behavioral framework. Lucian, a man whose prior narcissism demanded absolute criminal control, now admits this peace eclipses the dopamine hit of power. Let us look at this together, shall we? The human mind teaches us a profound lesson here. True victory is never about standing over the ruins of your abusers. The ultimate triumph is simply finding someone who will help carry the crushing weight of your past rather than adding to your trauma. We must strip away the romantic illusions society attaches to trauma. Fairy tales offer a deeply flawed narrative, because the human brain does not simply erase profound psychological damage overnight. For over 12 months, Emma exhibited classic hypervigilance, pacing the halls of Lucian's estate like a confined patient caught in a syndicate war. But observe her neurological state right now. Her brother is secure, the threat is neutralized, and her nervous system is finally regulating. She has moved beyond the primal fight or flight response. This leaves us with a grounding truth to apply to our own lives. Genuine peace is never a random prize you stumble upon. It is a psychological fortress you must construct with your own bare hands, brick by heavy brick, and then fiercely defend forever. In our final observation, Emma leans against bandaged Lucian. Together, they watch dawn break over a city that actively tried to destroy their psychological stability. Tomorrow may trigger another wave of violence, as that is the pathological nature of their environment. But right now, the cognitive static is gone. You and I have probably made the mistake of thinking otherwise. But here is the reality. A true home is never just a physical structure. It is finding one fiercely damaged soul who examines your darkest, most violent behavioral traits and absolutely refuses to walk away. After 15 agonizing years of chronic paranoia, Emma is finally shutting down the engine. The suffocating adrenaline loop is broken. She closes her tired eyes and she simply breathes.